I have a feeling the fan was quieter than me. I'm wondering if it'll be
So it's on.
I
All
don't know.
right.
We'll
I
see.
mean, I'll edit this and everything, right? So, and not post until like we all come to consensus. But so I thought that for our first recording, we could just go around and introduce each other. So basically, say whatever you feel is relevant and maybe something that our speakers might want to know about you. Um, so my name is Min, and I am an HIV counselor. That's my profession. I'm currently a graduate student in a Master's of Counseling Psychology program, and I am a first and half generation Vietnamese American.
My name is Lamar Smith. I am a clinical psychologist. I do therapy for a living. I also do trainings on LGBT cultural competency issues as well. I am African American, and I think that's about all for me.
I'm Jonathan Thames. I currently work at a translation agency. I manage our quality assurance. I have background mostly in area studies and public administration, and I am Euro-American.
Hello, my name is Jeff. I come from a history of health and human sciences that included chiropractic, and I'm not currently licensed. I retired from that and also ordained ministry. And I'm currently a credentialed certified life coach, and I'm just as white as they come from southeast Missouri.
And we're all fabulous, just in case you were wondering, anybody.
Yes.
So our topic today, as we agreed, is on spirituality, and I think, I sent out like a video on like Jungian psychology, and then Jeff, you sent out a couple of articles, um, on, I guess he's an atheist who's spiritual, right? Just to kind of jive some of our ideas around. But what do you guys think of the article? Or the articles? I guess there were many of them.
I guess I would be interested to hear what Jeff thought about them first, since he shared them.
I was taken. His name is Harris, and he apparently is a well-known published atheist. He wrote this article on spirituality, and I was struck by for him, identifying spirituality as that kind of moment that he thinks we all have had, or that time where we're aware that we've stepped into something or find ourselves in the presence of something that, in a sense, feels beyond us, whether it's a relationship that we're in, or for me, a particular piece of music, or looking at a sunset that just takes your breath away, and finding that moment of kind of awe and wonder that, yes, eventually may be all explained away by science somewhere, but in the meantime, we still find ourselves with that sense of sort of outside of ourselves. And he was careful to distinguish between that and turning it into something codified in religious terms, leaving that aside, but simply the experience of what for him is the spiritual.
What is codified?
Put into words.
Yeah, he also talked a lot about, kind of in that same vein, kind of that living in the moment, where you feel the transcendence of doing a particular task, where your mind has stilled, basically. So that kind of reminded me a lot of the sort of secular talks about meditation and mindfulness that they use a lot in therapeutic talk now, as well as things like a-religious yoga and things of that nature.
That part reminded me of peak experiences, and kind of more of the humanistic psychology vein, just because I find that that's how I've always conceptualized those moments, when you're kind of in the zone with whatever you're doing, whatever your task at hand is, and time just seems to slip away, and you're just kind of being creative or letting some kind of creation flow through you. I think it's really interesting to be in that moment and notice how spiritual that can seem. and you kind of come out of it and go, wow, I'm so energized, even though I've used a lot of energy and I've spent a lot of time, and yet somehow I'm rejuvenated by that experience. So that's one thing I kind of keyed in on there.
Like the flow that Abe Maslow talks about, right? I was interested in some of the reactions that people had to him using the word spirituality, and some people didn't really. A lot of the atheists didn't like the fact that he used the word spirituality.
Did they have ideas of what word? I don't remember if they put forward ideas of what would be a better word.
Right, I don't think so. Do you remember? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I just remember a couple being offended that he would attempt to put the word spiritual to anything, because for them it bespeaks. I had the feeling that they thought he was kind of rolling over into religion or something. I don't know, but they didn't like that. So, okay.
It's very much, I feel, in the same vein as like the deconstruction of like structures. A lot of deconstructionists like to deconstruct, but then they don't offer any reconstruction.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it might be helpful, if they could offer suggestions as well. Speaking of the flow in Abe Maslow, is anybody familiar with transpersonal psychology?
I'm familiar.
No.
A bit. It's been a while.
Yeah. Well,
Remind me in this.
so transpersonal, I guess, is a spin-off, so to speak, of humanistic. So Abe Maslow, I guess, who's famed for the hierarchy of needs, went on to, I guess, realize that there's beyond the self-actualization, the top of the pyramid, that there's more, there's beyond the self. So he teamed up with some people, and actually in a sort of meeting like this, where he teamed up with people like, what's his name, Stanislav Grof, from San Francisco, who's a big like LSD psychedelic psychotherapy guy, and some other people to form the fourth wave of therapy after humanism. And there, transpersonal psychology is all about like spiritual psychology. And I was actually looking to a couple of transpersonal institutes in the Bay Area before I settled on Pacifica. Pacifica is not really transpersonal. The only transpersonal-esque element is some transpersonal people draw on Jung because of the collective unconscious, which is transpersonal. But that's about as transpersonal as they get there. Yeah, it's definitely more psychoanalytic. But I'm pretty interested in transpersonal psychology. A lot of psychedelic. I mean, I'm kind of a big explorer of that these days, and I've always gotten spiritual experiences from psychedelics. I'm trying to see if I feel the flow. I mean, I guess I feel a different kind of flow. It's definitely different from peak experiences that I get in waking ego consciousness. But I'm wondering if, well, I'll talk about like, I guess, my peak experiences, but I'm wondering if you guys have had peak experiences, or what you would categorize as a peak experience.
Oh, when I was a boy, I had a picture of Neuschwanstein Castle, the fairy tale castle that you see in Bavaria, on my bedroom wall. And I said, when I grow up and get money, I'm going to go there. And so in 2004, I learned of a tour group that was going to Europe for 10 days, and it included a stop over there. So I signed up, and when I hiked up the snowy trail and put my hand on the wall of that castle, I was living my dream.
Wow.
And it was a peak experience. I don't recall that I put any specific God language to it, or religious language to it. I just remember my heart being thrilled that I had this idea, I had taken advantage of the opportunity, I had gotten myself there, and there I was.
Wow.
And I can feel that deep within, I can feel my hand on the wall as I tell that story. Yes.
Wow. Like a connection with something beyond yourself.
And we can put all kinds of words to it, but just putting my hand on the wall, there it is. And when you've had it, I think when we've had that experience, when we're there, we can verbalize it until we all yawn and just want to go to sleep. But there's nothing like that moment.
Yeah, I've had a lot, I think, with the arts, because I've always done acting and music as well, and I always found that when I was performing a piece, whatever that was, I was just there, and I wasn't even myself. I was just kind of doing what I knew that I was doing, and even sometimes improvising on top of that. And for me, that was always an experience of just being completely outside of myself. I was like not even present. I was just the vehicle for which, whatever is coming is going to flow through. And for me, that was always a great feeling, and I always left so energized and so feeling so whole, I think, just from having done that. And that's something I still, I really love, and I connect with that aspect, the artistic, creative side, being able to use that as an outlet for peak experiences.
And I envy watching performers who are in that moment where if they're playing guitar, they're the master of that instrument.
Oh yeah.
Or what piano, or their voice, whatever it is. They just are so there. Whoa.
In sports, they call it the zone.
Yeah.
The zone.
There is something interesting about it in terms of how it does affect other people, though. I think it does tend to draw in other people, because if they perceive you to have that energy and kind of be in that space where you're just emoting or doing whatever you want to call it, it's like, wow, you're so entranced that you want to grab a piece of what that person's energy is. And so you kind of get drawn in, just as an audience member watching something like that, which I think is interesting in how that interacts socially.
I think that reminds me of like ancient kind of spiritual theater, like the mystery theaters and things like that, where in Greek time, but before that as well, where even just a local spirit person would do a dance or tell a story, and as they reached that kind of heightened experience, everyone else was drawn into it. You're right. It was that social aspect where they could see and be a part of the divine, just by seeing someone act the part and reach it in that way. So that reminded me of that as well.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of being able to participate in a few Native American drum circles, and that same thing kind of happened. The it's just music, it's rhythm, but then you sing to get into it. There's like chanting, and then there's dance, and the next thing you know, you really start to feel the spiritual aspects of it kind of take hold, and it's very wonderful to watch that kind of develop as layer upon layer of the ritual unfolds, and you kind of do find yourself getting entranced with it, and you feel kind of a shared group sense that everybody's kind of, sometimes there's call and response, sometimes there's other things that are happening between the drummer or the dancer and the crowd, but either way it's very interesting. You really do get a good sense of community in that sense.
What is call and response?
When perhaps like a singer sings a line and then the crowd responds back that line, mirrors back the line, or something like that.
Actually, Min and I participated in a ritual before where drums were used to enter an altered state, and in my time in the pagan community, of course, the rituals usually have both the physical aspect to kind of get you involved, as well as the spiritual or unseen aspect.
Was this last Halloween?
Yeah.
The Wicked one, okay.
Yeah. Where we had a Samhain ritual. And went to the other side and
was it a peak experience for you?
I mean, I'm thinking about all of the different kind of altered states that I've had, and for instance, drugs like marijuana, for instance, gives me a certain altered state that I don't particularly enjoy, and I don't usually experience it as divine or transcendent. Then there's that kind of peak experience of being wrapped up in the action of the moment, like if you're running or you're doing something like we talked about, like you're in the zone. And that to me is different again from when I'm doing an active visualization, or I'm participating in a ritual, or I'm doing a deep meditation, where it's a different kind of altered state. So I think to me they're all kind of different. They might all be getting at different parts of that transcendent experience. You can kind of triangulate into what do they all have in common. But the feel of them is always a little bit different in my mind. Yeah.
I experience peak experience through art as well. Often watching a movie. So Jonathan usually witnesses my transcendent experiences. The last time I think it was, what's that film?
Gravity.
Gravity, right? Yeah, I really felt it when it started to land, and it was just like, oh, I felt the divine. Let's just put it that way. And I experience spirituality very psychologically, and by that I mean I think my journey to the divine started. I guess Buddhism really laid the foundation for me in terms of like I don't even second guess or question reincarnation. Like I feel like that's just a thing. And then I think analytical psychology really kind of formed a framework for accessing spirituality for me. Right, kind of, it just makes sense through that lens. And with that, I mean, I experience counseling as very spiritual. So I really experience the flow, and time goes by, and you know, really quickly and stuff like that. When I'm counseling people and helping people, I experience it very, very spiritually. Yeah. Do you experience it that way?
You know what? It's interesting that you bring that up because that is true. I experience the same thing when I'm in session with someone. I actually feel so privileged to be able to be in a space where someone is sharing something so personal with me, and to me that I think that's the reason that I'm able to kind of experience that as a divine experience as well, you know. And I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't know what I'm doing in there. I'm just kind of in the zone, and words will come to me that I don't even remember thinking beforehand, or you know, whatnot. It's just kind of like it'll just flow out, and I'll say what I feel at the moment, and I guess it works. People keep coming back, so I can only assume something's working. But yeah, I definitely experience that as kind of a peak experience as well. The time will flow. I'm horrible with my time when I'm in session, and it's just because I feel so connected to whoever I'm sitting with, and it's such a privilege to be able to sit with someone and be in a helping capacity that I just, everything else goes out the window. I'm not even, me doesn't show up, something else shows up.
I mean, Jungian psychology has a great metaphor for it, which is the container in alchemy. So we create that safe space for the mystery that is the human being to come forward. And oftentimes they're not able to when they don't have that container, the therapeutic container, as Jung called it. So my journey, like I had said, to the divine has been actually, the more gay I feel like I've gotten, the more closer to God I feel like I've become. And I know that for many people that's not true. You know, they have their ups and downs, especially in a Christian dominant culture. So I'm curious about, well, we've already kind of talked about it, but I guess for our listeners' sake, can you guys also maybe share a little bit about your journey to the divine? Your continued journey, I guess.
I went to Bible camp when I was about, I don't know, 11, 12, something like that, and heard the message that we are all sinners and that Jesus died for us, and that we need to give our heart to Jesus and then we'll be saved. And so I gave my heart to Jesus, and I had an experience that, as I've related this to other people, one man said, well, gee, that sounds just like what I had on a heroin trip one time. And I said I felt like I was washed through with this warm river of love. For me, that was, I had a history of not trusting that anyone loved me, and so to hear that there was this being out there who knew my name and really loved me was incredible for me. That has continued with me through these years, in that I relate to the lines in the song Alfie, something even non-believers can believe in, I believe in love. So in many ways I'm no longer the believer that I used to be in terms of traditional Christianity. and yet I keep coming back to love. And for me, that's God.
You know, for me, it's really interesting because I grew up in the Baptist church, as many African American people do, and it's it's traditionally seen as a very pretty conservative branch of Christianity. For me, I was always part of a more progressive Baptist congregation, if that makes sense to some people out there, I
Is
guess.
there such a thing?
I know it's hard to imagine in a lot of ways, but I mean, my pastor, being my childhood pastor, was always um, more progressive than a lot of other old school ministers that we went to go visit in other churches. People weren't, it wasn't hellfire and damnation preaching. It was more like, well, let's look at the world and let's see, what we can do to make it better. And now that being said, there wasn't explicitly positive talk with the LGBT community. There wasn't a lot of overtly negative either. I believe there was maybe a handful of times that it was even kind of mentioned in passing in church for me. But nonetheless, as I started to grow older and come out to myself and all that kind of stuff, I did feel a certain disconnect just by virtue of the fact I think that I felt like so many religious congregations, including the Baptist congregation as a whole, was pretty negative towards the LGBT community, and so that did create a sense of distance for me. That being said, though, I never felt like I could abandon or disregard my faith. I still consider myself a very spiritual person. That has changed about how that looks. I'm not so much into church as a whole. I think there's really fun parts of it. I love the singing and a lot of that kind of stuff, but not as an institution in the sense of oh well, this is what we do, this is what we believe, and it's all codified. I think that each person has a spiritual journey that they undertake individually. You can join with others certainly to have shared experiences in that, but for me, I really look at the spiritual journey as a primarily individual task. And so with that, I've definitely, and it's ironic because I actually got that more from reading the Bible. When I started to actually read it, I got to that age where I was like, oh, let me pick up this thing. So in reading that, I cued in on a lot of interesting passages for me, like you were saying, Jeff, that focused on love above all else, and that didn't necessarily jive with what I was hearing from a lot of religious communities. And so that was really impactful in terms of my own spiritual journey, just to hear more about what the Bible actually says in terms of love, in terms of community, in terms of acceptance. All of those things I think helped me accept myself and helped me work on unconditionally accepting others just in a general sense. And then plus reading of various religions as well. I've looked into Buddhism and Jewish thought and even just all kinds of different things, Eastern religions of all sorts actually. And I've found that tends to be an overarching theme, is just love, acceptance, trying to reduce suffering in the world. Those kinds of things I think are definitely goals that I can get behind 100%. So that kind of has become the melting pot of my spiritual journey, is to look at all of those things at the same time and figure out how I can interpret them for myself.
I guess if we're taking turns, I think I also grew up very religious. My parents were missionaries. They were Baptist missionaries, actually, and so we lived in Zambia in Africa for 2 years while they taught at a seminary. And then when we came back to the US, we were actually still missionaries to all the unwashed in America. And they were very radical for their tradition. So they were part of what is known as the emerging church, which was kind of a group of Christians who were theologically very orthodox but wanted to completely revolutionize what church looked like. So during that time there was a lot of emphasis on informality, escape from the high church, even in the Protestant traditions, de-emphasis on kind of marginalization of alternative lifestyles. Mostly at the time that meant, having tattoos and things like that. This was in the 90s, but it did have to do as well with alternative lifestyles. And so we had a house church in my home for many years where believers and non-believers kind of got together, and actually there were also a lot of Buddhists and a Wiccan or two who joined the community. It became where it was kind of a shared journey under the auspices of Jesus. So it was an interesting upbringing. My parents were both very broad-minded, but super keyed into their own personal beliefs, which they passed down to my sister and I. And so when I started coming out, I definitely had a lot of theological baggage that I worked through. And that took a long time, actually. As a kid, I was used to being an apologist for Christianity, so I knew all the arguments. So I had to defeat all my old arguments about homosexuality, and then build up new ones. So that took some time, probably through high school. And then by the time I went to college, I became an apologist for the LGBT community, for the Christians, and I participated in an ongoing discussion group with the Christian groups on campus, where they were kind of saying, hey, this was in Seattle, which was much more liberal than Texas, where I had been, and so the Christian community there was like, we do not understand alternative sexualities. We don't know what to do with it, but it seems like something we really have to figure out, which I think was smart of them, if a little slow. And so they made the effort, and I suddenly was the expert on all things gay in the Bible. So that was interesting.
Reading homoerotic subtext? Or?
A lot of it was, finding inconsistencies. I mean, you can always have fun with David and Jonathan, but, and looking where so much of their theology didn't come from the Bible, came from thinkers after, not even the apostles, although Peter and Paul obviously are major contributors there, but like St. Augustine and things like that, who would just have this enormous hold over modern Christian theology, that if you don't really look into it, you just assume it's all in the Bible, when in fact it is not. And if you take that as the end-all be-all of Christian thought, then you do have kind of some room to maneuver, which I found interesting. But I did leave my faith, and I too felt very distanced from Christianity for a long time before finding another. It's interesting because I kind of view it as a religion, but it is probably the most decentralized religion there, which is paganism, which is a very broad term for a lot of distinct traditions that often don't agree with each other. And I'm kind of a very eclectic person, practitioner, in that kind of arena. The main difference is that the emphasis is on praxis, so it's all about practice over theology, over theory. So you can have different ideas about why you believe something works, but most people in the pagan community will agree that that thing does work, which I think I found refreshing. So yeah, I think it definitely impacted me. The religion did impact my upbringing when I came out.
What's an example of that, where they would say they might have different thoughts about it, but something that works? An example of something that works.
I think quite simply magic. I think almost everyone in the pagan community believes that there's this thing where you can work your will on the world, but they all have very different ideas about why it works. So a chaos magician would say, well, it's because belief is what's important. We shape our own reality. You can believe anything you want, and as long as you really believe it, it will have the effect you desire. And that's very kind of postmodern. And then you have kind of the most ancient beliefs where humans have no power, but you can petition the gods through this kind of magical technique, and then they will enact their will on your behalf. So they're very different kinds of ideas about why it works, but they both kind of come to the same conclusion, which is you can do this thing and something will happen. Yeah.
Sounds like a search for power.
Well, magic definitely is. Magic is you wanting to exert your will on the outside world. I mean, in Christianity, magic was just co-opted by the priesthood, and then maligned, so they couldn't call it that anymore. So then they had to call it miracles and things like that made it seem more divine. But it was really the same sort of looking for power over things.
So we're just about halfway through the program. It's an hour program, and we don't have any commercial interruptions yet. No commercial sponsors yet for our first podcast. But I can't help but notice another presence in the room for me anyway, and that is our fifth person, who I won't name out of respect, another mutual friend of ours who can't join us. Him and I have a lot of discussions about spirituality. That's actually most of the things that we talk about. And he's very theoretical, thinking, scientific. And one time, I just said, he asked me why I basically left Buddhism. And I said, well, there wasn't enough personal relationship with God for me in Buddhism. And he was like, oh, yeah, there's that part of it as well. And I think in our time, or postmodern era or whatever, we're very intellectual about God, and science I view as just another form of religion of our era. And for me, because I experienced God so personally, I have yet to have found, I guess, a modern school of thought that really engages. Praxis is a Greek word for, practice and then reflection, or practice in reflection, or something like that, right? So that there's a participation and then a sort of thinking about it, right, cognitively. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is the only school of thought that I found so far comes back to analytical psychology in terms of participating. Jung has the term participation mystique, participation mystique, I guess, and that is this sense of mystical participation, just being in the world and doing things and experiencing the divine just through everything, not just intellectually. I guess that's the closest thing that I can express to like a personal relationship with God. I feel like I talk to God every single day. I mean, how do you describe it? Being hit on the sledgehammer on my head with signs. But I guess from the outside that's what it looks like. But from behind my eyes, it's an active. I would describe it as an active participation with a certain kind of mindfulness that I bring to it, and the ability to see things in metaphors, which I believe is the language of the divine. It was the language that we in the divine can speak, I guess, together, mutually.
I think you made a comment that you treated as a throwaway that I think is pretty big, which is that science is also a religion. And that goes pretty much against what the article you shared, Jeff, said, where he was kind of saying, science is the end-all be-all of kind of objective truth. And so as soon as you start encroaching on that territory, you are getting into dangerous delusions, was what I got from his kind of writing. So I think I'd be interested in hearing whether anyone else here kind of thinks of science as a religion, and if so, how.
Yeah, I definitely, think that it has those components, because to me it's more about the concept of faith. There, you have to put faith in something. Just as a human being, I feel like it's very natural for us to do that to some extent, you know, because there is uncertainty in the world, there's uncertainty in our lives, and so in order to manage that and to feel safe in some manner or another, we kind of have to have faith that, okay, well, things will probably be okay. The sun will most likely come up tomorrow, and you just kind of have to build in some sort of faith in something, be that religious or otherwise. And I think science and technology has become kind of a faith for us, and it's become kind of our divinity, and especially in Western culture and specifically in the U.S., I feel like, just because we rely on it so much, we can't go anywhere without our cell phones, and those are linked into the internet, and then we have apps that allow us to communicate with each other and do different things in our daily lives that just allow us to function. What would happen if that went away? It would be the same thing as if, in the Middle Ages, all of a sudden the priesthood declared, that the whole town was, going to be burned by the divine or something. People would go crazy. There would be this, communal uproar of, oh my gosh, what do we do? The bottom has fallen out of our world. How do we continue on? And I think, thinking of it in those terms, like how much do you rely on something to feel secure? I think when you kind of put it in that terms, I think you were able to see technology and science as a very big, very similar to religion. People just rely on it, and it becomes something that we feel so connected to that it's almost an extension of ourselves, and it's something that we put a lot of faith in. And even science, of course, operates by rules, but there are still boundaries to our knowledge. So at some point, science does cross into faith. A lot of work is being done right now on quantum theory and, things like that deal with a great deal of uncertainty. And the numbers match up one way if you're looking and observing in one area, and then they match up another way if you're observing another way. And so there comes a point where even the most hardcore scientists have to say, you know what, I think this is what's going on, but I know that there's more explanations out there, and I can't fully explain why this could be true. So there's some level of faith there.
I love the terms they use, like the singularity, for the moment before the Big Bang,
Yes, yes.
or how the Big Bang is like, how do they describe it? It was just so like, oh, we're talking about Genesis,
Yeah.
where it's like everything came out of nothing in like an unmeasurable instance or something like that.
Light emerged, and
You're like, I've read that story.
Somewhere.
Seems familiar.
So psychology likes to think of itself as a science, and I guess it technically.
Sorry.
And I guess for the most part, it technically is. But I think where metaphysics and science diverge is psychology is about experience. So if you can experience it, it can be empiricized and somehow. And so I think that is linked to how I experience spirituality, which is experience, and not just cognitive experience, but just sensual experience or any kind of experience that I can kind of go, oh, okay, that was the divine. Whether it be like a feeling or intuition or what have you. I think so in that way, if we were to kind of broaden the scope of what we mean by science a little bit, then I guess I also experience spirituality scientifically.
I think to me, science is knowledge, and so I view it as kind of the parts that you can fit into a framework which is your worldview. And so you can make kind of an atheist, what science will tell you is assumed to be the default worldview, which is it's an atheistic mechanical universe. Then you can make that your worldview. But I feel like if you have other worldviews, I think it's a false kind of logic that you can't use the fruits of science, which is similar to actually what struck me when you were talking, Lamar, with you said, you know, technology and science, and suddenly they were conflated. It was one and the same thing. That, you know, if you're religion, you have to be in the medieval ages, because how else could you be thinking in that way? And so I think I'm very interested in how you can take the fruits of science, which is knowledge and kind of observed reality, and then fit it into your own worldview that maybe is not atheistic, or maybe it is, but there's this spiritual idea of what that means, which I think pushes the boundaries of the traditional atheist worldview, in some ways, kind of more in the more leading edge psychological ways, talking about lived experience versus what we can actually quantify. So I think that would be how I viewed it. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what people mean when they're talking about magic or supernatural power or miracles is kind of tipping the scales of chance, you know, and so there's kind of always this idea that there's a random factor and anything could happen, you know, and scientists will tell you, well, there's like a 1 in 5 billion chance that would happen, therefore it's impossible. And I think people who believe otherwise would say, well, there may be some tools at your disposal by which you could increase the odds a little bit, or drastically, which I think, to me, then often it still fits into the rules that science has uncovered. It's just finding the loopholes and the ways that the world breaks its own rules, you know.
The world breaks its own rules.
I've seen a flash mob of some shopping center where a group staged the Hallelujah Chorus, Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, in the middle of Christmas shopping season. And I just get moved to tears by it because I love the piece, and to see all these happy faces. I realized that music is math, and so some mathematician with the right instruments could reduce Handel's Hallelujah Chorus to a series of blips and numbers and graphs, and flood it on a screen, and well, there's the Hallelujah Chorus. It's just a bunch of math. That won't strip it of its emotional power to me. No matter what they might show me, I'd say, hey, okay, I hope that person just really loves that he can graph all this. Did he get to enjoy the music? I don't know, and I don't care, because
The experience.
it's something about the experience. For me, there's something about trusting experience that I'm still learning to do, because to step into something, and for me, well, a peak experience was putting my hand on that castle there, and that didn't really involve other people. I mean, I didn't run around saying, look what I did, look what I did. But the experience of when I'm with someone, and that I was recently with a man, and I stepped into the space of finally accepting myself as a gay man who really enjoyed being with another man, the deepest level I ever have in my life. Now, some scientists could come along and hook up monitors and brain waves and say, oh, well, this is what happens, and here's what your heart doing. All I know is that I've had an experience that I had never had, and that will stay with me the rest of my life now, because I chose to be vulnerable and to allow myself to go to a place that I had always held myself back from just a bit, and thought, hey, I feel safe with this person. What would happen if I just chose to accept that this is really sweet?
And when
Now,
you
divine, I don't know. That, you know, you might label that divine, and if so, good, okay.
Well, when you say that, you know, it really made me think of basically that's kind of where science and spirituality depart, in the sense that when we talk about the spiritual, what comes up for me is more experience, and when I think of science, I think more analysis, you know, and a lot of times if you try to analyze an experience, you you may come up with something that represents it in another way, but it does take something away from, or it lacks some quality that the experience had as a whole. You know, kind of the Gestalt idea that somehow the whole is greater than just the sum of those parts. And when you analyze it, you're not going to necessarily recreate the experience that you had. You're just going to kind of get a paler version in some sense. And so, if anything, that would be kind of where I would say they do differ, just in how you're choosing to look at the experience.
I think God is a mathematician in many senses. I mean, our unnamed friend is a big math person. He took all the calculuses and even went to chaos theory, where he was like, yeah, where all those rules flew out the window. And I was gonna make a comment about, when you were talking, Jeff, what I connected with was the very spiritual idea of surrendering to the unknown, this scary, like mystery, I guess. And that's actually in every religion. There's an idea of surrenderance, right? And that's actually one of the pillars of my spiritual practice is surrendering my ego. So again, I connected very much back to analytical psychology, which is there's this idea, which is very similar to Hinduism. There's the idea of Brahman and Atman, or the ego and the self with a capital S, and that the Atman or the self with a capital S is somehow connected to the divine. It's the God image, and I think where Jung tries to be very scientific in understanding spirituality is in that concept, that there is a God image in every culture, in everyone. We either cast it onto science or onto a dictator, like I'm just gonna say they often do in North Korea, and it just becomes this awe for people. Sometimes in recovery, people talk about, in AA and stuff, they talk about drugs being the God image. And so I guess from a certain perspective, my perspective, there's a certain place where that God image should be casted onto, where it's healthy. There's a healthy manifestation of the God image, and less healthy places to cast on.
I connect with that idea of the self, like everyone has a piece of God, because I think that's, for me, I feel like that's the vehicle through which we experience the divine, is having a piece of it within us, where we're all a part of this great whole somehow that is connected. We're not separate from nature, but we are one with the universe, as it were. And for me, when I go into like meditation or something like that, one of my goals, if you could have a goal in meditation, which is a little counterintuitive, but one of the things I think about before I go into it is, I want to be able to experience things outside of myself. I want to be able to experience the universe as much as possible, and kind of let myself go of my image of self and really expand into that self, capital S, kind of idea that there's more that's encompassing who one is. And so I connected with that when you said that. I think that's something that I've definitely kind of interpreted myself and used in my spiritual practices.
I read an article. The seminary that I attended puts out a quarterly, or how often it is, kind of e-newsletter to students and alumni. And one of the faculty announced that they're starting a 12-month series of looking at pain. And then he told his story. He's 35, is married, has 2 young daughters, and he has intractable pain from some kind of spinal problem that he has, and he's on painkillers. And from his description of it, it sounds like for a 35-year-old man, he said some days he can just barely make it through the day. And he's never disclosed that on campus anywhere. He's just kept it to himself. And as I read through that, watching him develop this, I found that he really kind of sank himself into and gave himself to the fact that here he is a representative of a Christian seminary where there can still be a tendency to want to sort of prettify the world through God's eyes. And so what do we do when we live with this kind of pain? And where do I find God in this? And what am I communicating about God when his description of going to the neurologist office with one man crawling around on his hands and knees and moaning, and these other people just in terrible straits, and he's there in terrible straits himself. And so I was just taken with how I can avoid, even in meditation, I don't want to experience that dark side of me.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to have some enlightened experience come out of this, and could I just run from this really crappy part of Jeff that's sitting right there on the floor, meditating at the same time? How do I embrace that and love it?
You read my mind. I was gonna bring that up. That shadow side of spirituality, that hard to, I don't like
Ugly,
part.
unhappy part.
Every time I hear about a shooting, somewhere in the States, and there's always, every other month there's something.
Or a beheading now.
Yeah.
Is there beheading now?
Down in Oklahoma.
Oh my God. I have, a crisis of faith, so to speak. I challenge one, just like, well, what does this mean? Where is God in this? My hunch is it has something to do with our culture's dichotomy of God. God becomes all good, right? Instead of God is all of that, which is the whole spectrum, the pantheon of dark and light. However, I experience God as so benevolent and holding and all that. No, that's not true. I often experience God in illness. I experience God in symptoms. So I can't say that's completely true either. It does feel like it leans more benevolent.
Generally.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think pretty much anyone who's has a spiritual bent has thought about that question. What about the darkness in the world? For me, one thing that I landed on that I think, I don't know, I resonate with, makes me feel better. I don't know, whatever you want to say. But I kind of feel like for me, something that works was the belief that the soul or the spirit is immortal, and that our bodies, what exists here is a manifestation that is not really who we are, in a sense. That really we are experiencing this for the purposes of getting somewhere spiritually. We're learning lessons, we're developing, we're evolving spiritually speaking, and all of these experiences, whether we would label them good or bad as human beings, are all kind of just not real. They don't really harm you, because in the end you're a spiritual being. In the end you're metaphysical, and so therefore we can have the illusion and experience the illusion of pain. We can experience the illusion of suffering. We can experience the illusion of loss and grief. But then when we rise out of that, we're able to kind of say, okay, that's what that feels like. You're able to remember the experience, remember the feeling, but everybody kind of comes out of it okay. Now, I don't know, that's just something that I landed on that I think I found mentally comforting. And I felt like, because it is hard to explain, why would a just and benevolent God allow horrible acts to occur in the world and not intervene and stop such things and whatnot, but because I find, like you said, feeling like there is God in pain and there is God in illness, and I experience that as well. And so I feel like those are things that I do learn something from. I do gain spiritually from moments when I might have gotten a little too might have started depending a little too much on myself, and then suddenly I'm sick, or suddenly something is beyond my control, and what would normally be experienced as a negative, I can learn a good lesson from and kind of grow spiritually from it. So that's why I feel like, oh wow, maybe that's something that's built into the system to help us learn and grow.
I don't know, that pushes a chord for me. I wouldn't know how to communicate that to to date, the 2,700 orphans,
Mm-hmm.
Ebola orphans, who nobody wants to touch in West Africa, right? Nobody will have anything to do with these little children. They won't touch them, nothing. How do I say, oh, there's some lesson in this for you, that when you grow to be an adult, you'll come to, I don't know. And I had a patient once who had cerebral palsy, and she would come in, limp in with her, and she'd say, people look at me all the time and they say, oh, God bless you, God bless you.
Oh, wow.
She'd look at me and say, what's that supposed to mean to me? And I never had an answer that I thought could make sense to her. So I don't know.
I mean, I think when I found my new spirituality, a lot of it was about taking the divine off a pedestal. I don't know, I think, and I recently told my father, I'm just not that interested in the question of evil, where it comes from, what happens to it, because, and there are people who spend their whole lives trying to figure that out and trying to explain it. Atheists, religious people, lots of people, theists, lots of people do that. And to me, I think I just have this belief in the world as it is. And I think that was one of the things that most struck me about my new faith was it wasn't really an emphasis and belief in ancient gods or something like that that really interested me. It was just in kind of that the world is the way that it is, and I have to live in it. And I can't pretend that it's different or it should be different, or like the idea of the world being fallen to me. I was like, why even believe that it's fallen when it's just the way that it is? Animals have to eat each other. Some animals are nice, some animals are mean, and that includes humans and chimpanzees, and that includes gerbils and chickadees. Every kind of animal has kind of that dark and light in them, as do plants, and so I don't even feel the need to make it into a divine problem, nor do I expect the divine to shield me from. I'd like them to, and I've asked, but I don't really expect that that's their job, to cause suffering or to cause good things to happen. I just think that's how the world works, is that these things happen, and it can be horrible and tragic, and it can also be wonderful and uplifting, and it does seem to be often random. And to me, trying to make that have meaning is kind of a pointless endeavor, because the meaning is in the living. And you may have a life that is horrible, but that's your life. You can't have someone else's life, so I don't know, I think that's how I view it. I'm now thinking, oh, I'm such an atheist compared to most theists. I don't often.
It's definitely a different paradigm.
Yeah, I have a very different kind of way of viewing,
We have a couple of minutes left, and I guess we can have closing comments.
Yeah.
We
I
should
guess-
join hands.
I guess I'll reserve my closing comments to comment on our last sort of idea. I guess this is where I come back to Buddhism, which is life is suffering, and there are karmic rules that govern the universe, and that it's like the image I get is like weight training. There's a resistance, which is suffering, in order for you to evolve and grow and build your muscles, and which is I've found out my purpose in life, which is to evolve spiritually, and the suffering, the friction that I come into, and not just in this life, I'm thinking, big macro, multiple lifetimes. And it could be maybe, there was a life where I did die at 2 years old because of some disease. But in terms of the bigger picture, that resistance is what helps me grow spiritually. Without the resistance, if God was all benevolent, I wouldn't evolve. So I think I come back to that idea.
Yeah, that's what, kind of works for me too. I just look at everything that is a struggle, is a challenge, as something that I can potentially take something from, which allows me to be in a mindset of not wallowing in despair when I have an issue, but rather looking at it as an opportunity for growth and trying to find some kind of, experience that I can take from it to make myself into a better person for having that. So that's kind of how I look at adversity in my own life.
I think what I gained was service. I think I then thought, I didn't really think so much about improving myself, but about improving the world. I think that's where it came in. That if you aren't expecting someone else to come in and save the day, then you need to go out and do it. And so I think that's the way that I've taken it in terms of how to enact it in my life. That's kind of paradigm.
I can be a more loving person or not, and that's totally up to me. That's my call.
Amen.
Mhm.
All right, so I guess that concludes our first podcast on spirituality. If you like us, please subscribe to, etc., etc. No, we haven't figured all that out yet. But thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll have more for what.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Bye bye.
Ciao. Bye.
Oh no.
If you hit delete.
No, we lost.
We'll
No.
practice loving.